Hey everyone, I'm Noctis Corvus, but you can call me Noctis. Today we're here with a short but sweet speed paint of a drawing that started as an idea quite some time ago. It then changed almost entirely during development, and then gave me very few issues past that point. So let's just get straight into that discussion then, shall we? This is certainly an eventful one. This idea started with my 30-day sketch challenge that I did at the start of March this year, and then I posted about April for context. I had one of those days during it, I don't remember which off the top of my head, where the prompt had been something like cloud, and I worked through a few variants of ideas before coming to settle on any sort of stronger idea. I had some that I liked besides this one, yet for that day in particular, this was kind of the main idea that I wanted to continue with at some point. I had this idea of a flat section of a mountainside that would then be surrounded by the clouds. I was happy with it enough to set this all aside and to move on with matters for the day. I kind of just set it into its own folder, and then I left it for a fair few weeks whilst I continued with the challenge, and then also a little bit longer after the challenge as well, whilst I just worked on other ideas or interests that I wanted to explore a little bit more than this one. So that is all to say that it was left for quite some time before I came back to it. Now, when I did come back to it, I saw potential. I've had my fantasy world, something that I am realising that I'm mentioning a lot lately, since before I started this 30-day idea. It was definitely in the earlier phases, and I still had mountains of things to work out. Ironically, that including the locations of a fair few mountains. But anyway, I looked back at this idea when the world was taking on more shape than compared to when I first had this idea. And when I did come back to it, I had this idea that could tie this drawing in with the other world and kind of make this drawing act as a sort of first draft or first variation of a story that tied into that world. And to clarify, this wouldn't be a story of someone within the world. It would be a story told within the world itself that ties in with belief systems, and what the inhabitants of the world would tell one another. So, by this sense, it's a story inside of a story. Yet it also got me thinking more about what this drawing might be depicting itself, and also what the narrative of this single frame could be. So I set this aside once more and got to work. It did, however, mean that this drawing and sketch was just left for even longer before I ever came to add colour to it, or to develop it beyond basic ideas. I instead looked back at the world's religions that I had been working on, worked out where this idea may best fit or where it would make sense. And then I started to work out who would be involved in this story and what impact it would have overall on the world. I then worked out icons and little symbols that had nothing to do with this story, as well as attitudes and the way that the system would influence people exposed to it. In short, and to summarise all of this, I once again got lost within the world and kind of ironed out any issues that cropped up when I began to think further on this, all stemming from this one sketch. And really, it was rather helpful when I was doing this, as I then started to think of stories outside of this one with the figures that I already had established, and I sort of let myself follow that along until I ran out of ideas, or I realised that I really needed to look at something else. Only then, after many more weeks, did I come back to this drawing to do the flat colours for it at the very least, since I kind of knew that I would want to continue it. I feel like if it sat untouched much longer, it would have been more likely that I kept ignoring it in favour of other things. But the idea then had been really vivid and something that I was excited for. So I did the flat colours when I had the moment and moved on again without issue. Simple, right? I had the flats and I would shade it soon. As you might have seen, this drawing then undergoes quite a change after the initial flat stage was quote unquote finished. Once I did the flat colours, I again got distracted by other ideas and continued to develop the world and other sketches for it, so this one kinda got pushed aside until more recently. However, between now and then, the idea has once again changed much more. There are more regional differences to account for in a single story, and also how I want to use the image has also changed, meaning a new format and layout is sort of preferred. Originally, the vertical layout wasn't really an issue, and it worked best for the composition that I had in the mind at that moment, and also any later uses that I kind of figured it would work out. However, recent developments mean that I would prefer to have it horizontal, landscape in other words, and that change was needed to be made. That's fine, I could easily just extend what I already had done to make it all work. However, I then again started to change things, and liked it more than what I did before. Now that then takes us into the next part of the processes, which is the colours. You see, originally I wanted to keep it quite bright and vibrant, thinking that that would best match the tone of the story. It would be bright, harmless, and really a sort of a low-stakes myth in the world, more than any other story that I've done. It was meant to explain things to people before anything else, and that would be fine. It was especially fine in the earlier parts, where I didn't have as much of the world established, but the more that I worked on it, the more ideas that I had, and the more this story subtly shifted the drawing, and it also again gained other purposes in the world, and everything kind of became more. Now, the darker colours are meant to convey a sense of time more than anything. The character in question gained more depth, and the midday impression didn't really match anything for the moment. Maybe in some regions it would still make sense and it would still fit the character. But I also liked the later setting myself, since it more matched with what I am using it for now than if I hadn't made the change. So there is then one more goal that I had in mind for this drawing that I also haven't touched on yet either. You see, I also wanted to try some of the brushes that I have sat to the side, that I kind of love and really want to use, yet never quite found the best way to use them for me. Now, with Clip Studio Paint, there's an ability to download brushes that people share and upload, and I have found a lot that I really like and seem useful in the long run. Recently, this is a lot of the pastel brushes that I have found, something I did otherwise feel that Clip Studio had very few of compared to other sections that they had. Now I have a wider range, and I really wanted to get to use them and get used to them. And yes, I probably could have done more for this particular section, but I do see more applications for them in the future, which is a plus side to it all, even if it ends up being more subtly. Otherwise, the other part of this is that I also found a set that really helps with space drawings, and a few other areas that I am experimenting with in the background. The decision for the space background actually started when I accidentally copied the wrong thing into this drawing without meaning to, and I kinda liked how it was looking. I did redo it, draw something new for this, and that brush set that I found really helped me get the effect that I have always kind of been wanting now when I commonly look at space and galaxies. Especially recently because I have been working a lot with a character who has it as a motif, and really it's made things much easier since nothing before was working consistently. So yes, I use this drawing to also help further that familiarity with those sets. I can also see myself getting a lot of use from them going ahead, since I will only be working more with the space theme character, so it is also something that I am really glad to find now rather than later. It's also really helped their design come together, and it's really just made things much easier as well. Anyway though, and I know I am kind of moving and bouncing between topics quite quickly here, but it is a shorter one and I do still have a lot to say, so I hope you don't mind that. But we do have enough time here to begin looking at the details of the drawing itself. And that is also now that I've covered all of the progression as that I wanted to. So the first detail, though, that I do want to address is the person that I end up adding to it later in the process. You see, it was quite simple, and I even include the sketching details here, because I have their design in another file, though it also isn't a single set design. Let me just explain that one. See, this is a story in a story, so the details are some that differ between teller and region of the world. It is supposed to be a myth or a story of a religion in the world that some people believe and others dismiss. All of this is to explain that details like appearance for this character, all aspects of it, would be something more debated, or would be something that differed depending on where the story is being told. Their importance would differ, and everything for this character has more than one option, with only a few very common threads that people would agree on. Think of it as depictions of Greek gods, for example, as that's the closest thing I can consider at the top of my head. We always know Athena by a few defining traits that are commonly seen on her statues and depictions. And that's kind of what I was pulling from. Things would differ by region, but there would be a few agreed upon universally. In the original intent, though, they would have been front and centre by the edge of the cliff. That was a layout that I kind of preferred more when I had thought that the design was more solid, and that this character was more definitive or singular, which didn't make the most sense anymore. The more I worked with it, the more it made sense to obscure them for the images used as well. I mean, in how I need it now, the person isn't the important bit, yet the implications of it are. It's kind of why, as I worked, I obscured them with the mist and the clouds that surrounded the mountain, and I also gave them an easel that they would be working from, as that kind of ties more into who they are and what their story is about. Don't get me wrong, their appearance will definitely be more relevant to the later things that I do with the design. Though this time I preferred this approach for now. Also, just as a quick side note, the easel was deceivingly hard to draw, despite the fact that I literally have one almost always in the corner of my room. It gave me far more challenges than I thought it would. However though, there is one main detail to this that I also want to ensure I mention here, since it was something I decided on in the latter parts of this process, and I hadn't really planned it going into it. You see, I have mentioned that this drawing is for a purpose, has another reason to it that I don't want to mention quite just yet. And I also know that I can kind of get away with it because it isn't too relevant to most of the choices made. It is for something, and that influenced the choices, don't get me wrong, but the actual what didn't really matter much. So, right at the end though, I also realised that what this drawing was for and the way that this drawing had been was almost providing a perfect chance for another experiment that I've been wanting to work on. And it's also a minor experiment, it's nothing major that I really have been dying to do, but it's a minor one that kind of leads to a major one that I have been building up to as of late. See, for quite some time, I have been looking a little bit here and there at animation, and just doing little bits to experiment with how it works and what I can do with it. My main way of experimenting has, in the past, often been looking at moving lights or leaves. I've done a lot of dots moving in outcomes, and I have really enjoyed the process of simple and small things like that, just to give me a sense of motion before I then start to expand it into other, more complicated areas. And whilst I have done more complicated experiments than this with other tools, I haven't tried the keyframe animation method with Clip Studio Paint in particular. So I really wanted to see if it was something I could use for this manner in small amounts. I will note that I have tried it for a few other things to mixed results, and I have found other tools and things that let me get a lot more done in more effective ways. But I did want to see how it stood for simple things like this, so I could do the small things without having to change between files and folders and getting confused. Also, so I could do the small things without having to overcomplicate it necessarily. And in the end, it worked really well for something simple that also didn't need to change shape in motion, which actually pleasantly surprised me. I know that, yes, that sounds very, very limiting, but I can kind of see it being quite useful if I explore it that little bit more. And also, it kind of lets me get familiar with when to use this over something else instead. But for this drawing in particular, the subtle motion of the lights that didn't take too long to do really worked in my favour. I enjoy the approach of drawing every dot, letting it have its own path and such, but that can also get rather time consuming if I have a lot of little dots, which I often do. And I also can give them their own path with this method as well. I just know that I need to separate the dots into more layers, so some can move faster or slower and move in different directions. It gives it a more time-effective method for something the same as before. And that is kind of what I mean by this. The dots are simple, but before I wouldn't always do them because I felt that they took too long, or I just forgot to do them. With this, it's quicker, really, which I know it sounds like a really simple reason to prefer it, but it does matter a lot when I've got a lot of other things to work on. Now, if I wanted to, and I did also consider it, I could have also tried to add subtle movement to the clouds as well, to give this a little bit more something than just the lights. I mean, yes, if you look beyond the moving lights, the imagery is kind of a little bit stationary, and I maybe mind it a tiny little bit, but I also don't consider it the end of the world. It's an early experiment, and if it bothers me that much later, I can go back and change it between now and when this goes out if I really, really want to. However, part of me, which is the majority, is also just rather fond of it only being the lights that move, and what that can happen and what that kind of lets it be. Most of the time I don't notice the stillness besides the lights, and I don't want the movement to overpower things or make it less clear with the image movement. All of this is to say that I started with the lights, and I like it. I'm happy with it. So the final touches then was a gradient map. It felt a bit flat without one, so I started to experiment and mess with the idea of one that I found, and I quite like the subtle hint of yellow and orange that kind of mixed with the image if I lowered the effect of it in the long run. It also helped it give that further sense of time that I otherwise didn't quite have yet. And honestly, this drawing didn't take me too long to work on, yet it is still one of my preferred ones as of late. It's hard to say favourite, since I think every new drawing I finish is my favourite, until I end up staring at it too long and changing my mind. But I would still be claiming everything my favourite if I allowed myself to. There isn't anything wrong with that, but it also might get confusing and repetitive. But either way, I hope that you've enjoyed this one too, as I had a lot of fun with the experiments, and I can't really wait to see where this goes next. I have a few rather strong ideas, and one of the more complicated and time-consuming experiments is kind of getting to a point where it's coming to fruition in the background, and I am rather happy with that, as that then informs a whole load more of these later experiments going ahead, and opens the doors to a lot more that I will be doing soon. So I am really excited for that. However though, that is all that I have time for this week. I hope you've enjoyed this, as I have already said, and I hope to see you next time with whatever comes next. For now though, have a wonderful day and an even better week. And goodbye!